Well, good morning, everyone. It's 7:30 according to my clock here. I'm Jim Lewis, and I'll be working with you in this webcast. I want to just say a couple things about the program. First of all, it's a webcast, not a webinar. And what that means is instead of taking questions at the end in a verbal mode, which I find very difficult to do when I'm by myself and I don't have a co-facilitator, I'm going to be concentrating on just giving you information, and I'll take questions by email. There was an email address in the log-on instructions that you received, and please feel free to send those to me. And then what I'll do is I'll type up those questions and answers and send those to everyone who attended. We're also recording this, so if you have to leave early or want to review later, I'll be sending you a link to the recording, which will be posted on YouTube. So just a couple things about the title. It says 2 things you can do that will improve your bottom line significantly. And the key words there are you can do. I have a friend who likes to say he makes a 100% guarantee that if you don't do any of these things, nothing's going to change. But if you do them, we of course can't guarantee that everybody will get the same kind of results because every organization is different. But what kind of results can you expect? Well, several years ago, I taught project management for an organization that built buildings and dormitories and that sort of thing for a large university. And the fellow who was in charge of that program reported that over the next several years, I believe it was like 5 years, he estimated that they saved nearly $5 million in change orders. A large public utility up in northwest Washington State said that when they started working with me on project management, they were hitting about 50% of their project targets, and that within a year they were hitting 90% of those. That's a pretty good improvement. I also worked with an organization who bid on Navy projects, and they got quite a few of them and then lost their shirts on them because they were fixed price contracts, and it turned out that they took longer to complete and cost more to do than they had estimated. And so several years later, after I had trained almost 2/3 of the people in the building in project management, I did a follow-up with them, and they said, well, we don't get as many bids as we used to, but when we get one now, we make money on it, and that's what it's all about. I also have an organization I worked with on, they were doing product development in biotech, and when they followed my process for improving their projects, they found that their productivity in the lab had improved dramatically. They estimated about 100%, which means that they were getting twice as much done as they had previously, and that was a significant change. So that's what I'm offering you today, is ways to improve performance. And if you happen to be in a not-for-profit organization, you may not be trying to improve a bottom line particularly, but everybody nowadays is under pressure to try to deliver more with the same amount of funding or less, and so you can expect to get more for your investment. A few things about me so that you'll know where I'm coming from in terms of this program. I started out my career as an electrical engineer. I got a BS in electrical engineering from NC State University, and 15 years later, went back to school and got a PhD in psychology, and started a company called the Lewis Institute after my name in 1981. So this is my 35th year in business, and I've been doing training and consulting and project management for most of that time. I've written 12 books on the subject, several of which are shown on this particular slide. The one in the middle is a book I wrote with Alan Mulally, who some of you may know about. He was the chief engineer on the 777 airplane development program at Boeing, and then became the CEO at Boeing Commercial Airplanes. And in 2007, and I wrote this book with him while he was at Boeing, by the way. It was about how he manages projects and organizations. And in 2007, I got a phone call from the HR department at Ford Motor Company saying that he was going to be made their CEO. And on the day he took over as CEO, they were losing 16 or 17 billion dollars a year, which is 50 million dollars a day, 365 days a year, and he promised to make them profitable within 2 years, which he did without taking any government bailout money. And he demonstrated to me something that I had questioned for a long, long time, which was, can a CEO truly make a significant difference, especially in a company as large as Ford? And the answer is absolutely yes. There's a great book called American Icon that documents his work at Ford, if any of you are interested in it. And Alan and I both share a very strong bias that project management is something that's a core competence for most organizations. And my mission is to help executives excel at what they do. And the reason for that is I've found over the years that when I train project managers and they go back to work, they often aren't supported in doing what we teach them to do. In fact, Hewlett-Packard had a project management initiative a number of years ago, and they found that when they trained project managers in how to do it right, and they went back to the various divisions, and then the division managers wouldn't let them actually practice what they were taught, they ultimately left the organization. Their feeling was one of frustration and futility that they weren't able to do what they'd been trained to do, and so they sort of lost faith in the company. And so my mission at this point in time is to work with executives, because what I've found is if I don't start with executives and I start only with the project managers, then nothing happens. So if I can help you excel, it's going to benefit the entire organization, because if you know anything about leverage, you'll know that trying to find a point of leverage is one of the things that you do to get the most results, and you are that point of leverage, I think. Um, just to highlight the importance of project management, which we're going to be talking about a little bit, uh, the definition of a project is that it's a one-time job that has a definite starting point, definite ending point, well-defined scope of work, and typically a budget and all that sort of thing. And what that tells you is almost everything we do can be labeled projects, except for those things that are very, very repetitive, such as maybe claims processing or order processing or manufacturing operations and so on. And so clearly this is a core competence for almost any kind of organization. And I'm a little slow to catch on to things, but I realized a couple of years ago that executives do almost everything in project format, your strategic initiatives or projects and so on. And you don't need a real formal structured approach to managing projects, but you definitely need to do something better than what a lot of folks do. And that's not a criticism. The reason I think people don't use project management is because they've never been trained to do formal project management. And even when I started my career, I did what I call seat of the pants project management, and the structured approach can save you significantly. So let's talk about that. So the two things I'm going to talk about today are improving the management of projects in your organization, both at your own level as well as that of the people that work for you. And the other one that we waste a lot of money on is meetings. And I made a mistake when I typed up the notes for this slide. I said projects typically waste 35% of every dollar spent. Actually, the number is about 30%. And the Six Sigma people have been saying for a long time that most organizations run at a 3 Sigma level, which means that they waste about 30 cents of every dollar on every operation that they engage in. And that if they perform 1,000,000 steps, they will make about 34,000 errors. And if you can get down to Six Sigma quality level, that number drops to about 3 cents on the dollar and about 3.4 mistakes per million operations. So improving project management can save you a tremendous amount of money. And as Ben Franklin said years ago, a penny saved is a penny earned. Everything we save can go right to our bottom line. And of course, meetings also waste about 25% of every dollar spent on them. And so if you can reduce the waste in these two areas, you can improve your performance dramatically. And I'm convinced that it takes senior managers to do this. So what are we going to cover in the project management component? This slide shows you a list of those things if you have your notes in front of you. And if you don't, I'll just review them very quickly. First of all, we're going to talk about the cost of bad project management. And I'm going to report some results from the Standish group. I'm going to also talk about whether or not we've made any improvements since the early report done in 1986. And we'll talk a little bit about the effects of bad projects beyond just the money that we waste on them. Causes, there are too many projects for the available resources in most companies. I call bad project management pitiful project management because it is pitiful. We should be doing a whole lot better than we are given the amount of training that we've spent in the past 20 years, but unfortunately, I'm not seeing a lot of improvement. Not fixing systems and tools is another cause of problems. And then sometimes senior managers don't accept the reality of the numbers given to them by project managers, and you see this fairly frequently as it turns out. Then I'm going to talk about some cures, how to fix the problem. And this includes prioritizing projects, addressing systems and tools, supporting project managers, and using a stage gate system to manage your projects. Now, what does it cost us for pitiful project management? Again, I'm going to talk about the Standish Group study done in 1986, so I'm going to move straight forward to the next slide to show you that. Standish Group studied software development projects back in 1986, and they found that only 17% of those projects succeeded, that is, hit the performance, cost, time, and scope targets, and 50% had to be revised, that is, they were late, overspent, and so on, and 33% were actually canceled, and that was on $250 billion worth of software projects. Okay, so that's a pretty compelling statistic that says that we weren't doing a very good job back then. And what's really compelling about this is that if you look at the figures, they say that 83% of all the projects done got into trouble of some kind. Now, there is one caveat here. Success was defined as meeting the targets. And what I have learned in 35 years of doing this is that many of those targets are pulled out of the air. They're wishful thinking. They aren't established correctly. And my contention is that failing to meet unrealistic targets is not a failure of project management, but a failure of an organization to set realistic targets. So let's see if we're doing any better. This slide shows people looking at some of the things that happen that cause projects to get sunk. Scope creep, poor planning, unrealistic targets to begin with, inadequate systems, risk management problems, not having control. Now, Microsoft estimates they've sold a couple of million copies of Microsoft Project in the past 20 years. And I don't know how much money has been spent on training project managers, but I had a certificate program at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I was going up there 10 times a year to teach a 3-day seminar with about 30 people in every offering, and that's been going on now since about 1990 or so. And I've started a certificate program at NC State University in Raleigh, and we've put several thousand people through our program. And yet in follow-up interviews, I find that many of these folks aren't doing what they were taught to do. And if you do a search on the internet for the number of project failures in each discipline, for example, IT or software development or engineering or product development or even construction, what you'll find is that the numbers that I gave you earlier for the Standish study haven't changed a great deal. In other words, we are still failing with great precision. And it really surprised me to find that construction projects were that bad off, because construction in many cases is fairly well defined, and it's poorly defined projects that tend to be really problematic. But unfortunately, this figure, which I quoted earlier, that we waste about 30 cents of every dollar spent on projects, is still fairly true. What I understand is that the only real change that's been made is that we cancel projects quicker nowadays than we did back in 1986. Um, but here's what's really serious about this. Not only do you waste the money on projects, and in many organizations, about 75 to 90% of what they do is project based. And so if you add up the cost of all those projects you have, and if you lose 30 cents of every dollar spent on them, you have a huge economic loss there, which, as I say, goes straight to the bottom line if you can eliminate it. Now, the problem is that's not the only outcome of this whole thing. You also have market losses. For example, Hewlett Packard years ago found that if they were 1 month late to market with a new computer, they would lose about a third of the total product sales. And they reasoned over time that they could justify spending about 25% more than they originally intended, and it would only hurt profitability a few percentage points. So speed was life to them. That's true in many, many organizations. And one of the problems you have is that because it's so critical to be finished on time, anytime you put people under pressure to speed up their projects, what they tend to sacrifice is performance or quality of the product or service they provide. And even BMW may have been a victim of this back in 1984 when they released the 318i. I had a friend who was a big BMW enthusiast and convinced me to buy one. And that particular model had so many problems in it that they didn't make a 1985. They took it off the market to correct those problems. And I'm convinced that what happened was they released it on time because the window in the market opened, but they sacrificed P in the process of doing it. So you not only lose in that respect, but you can also hurt your reputation as an organization. I mentioned the turnover at Hewlett Packard, which, if you look at professionals who leave your organization, the replacement cost can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, and even at the very lowest levels of an organization with just basic labor, you're talking several $1,000s to replace people. So turnover can be a very high cost. And not only that, but morale tends to suffer. And I've seen many, many organizations where employees were very demoralized because they were being pressured to complete projects with too few resources, and ultimately what they felt was they were being set up to fail. And for that reason, morale suffered. Now, I told you that I was going to talk about some of the causes of project failure, and this is a list of just a handful. These are by no means all the causes. There are quite a few, but these are some of the top ones. We are, in many, many cases, doing too many projects for the available resources, and project managers in my classes tell me that when they ask their bosses for priorities, they're told it's all got to be done. Now, what that means is if there aren't any priorities, it's all got to be done at the same time. It's a joke, because you can't do everything at the same time with limited resources. You got to have unlimited resources to be able to do that. And it is, and I'm going to be blunt when I say that, it's an abdication of senior management's responsibility to set priorities when you tell people that it's all got to be done. Yes, it may all have to be done, but it can't be done at the same time. The other thing is that a lot of people are not allowed to actually do what they're taught. They go back to work, and the pressure is placed on them to get the work done very quickly, and planning is actually discouraged. So this net result is pitiful project management. The other thing that makes it pitiful project management is that when you're doing too many projects for the available resources, you're constantly having to shuffle your people back and forth between projects to keep them afloat. And that increases setup time, which I'll talk about again in a moment, and results in pretty poor project management in the long run. And then the next cause is not fixing systems and tools, which I'll talk about in a moment. And I've said senior managers sometimes won't accept the targets. So let's take a look at the first cause here, too many projects for available resources. I thought this slide captured the effect on employees of too many projects, because everybody's yelling at this poor person and showing her that she's behind schedule and she's not getting the work done that they need done, and so on. And that's pretty stressful. The first thing that I want to point out is that multitasking is a myth. We like to brag about being good multitaskers, and the truth of the matter is nobody can multitask. You can shuffle things, and we call that multitasking, but multitasking would mean really that you're doing several things simultaneously. That simply isn't possible. Even computers don't do it very well, and the only reason they can do it is because they have several microprocessors working on different facets of the issue. And if you and I had multiple brains, we might be able to multitask, but we don't. There is a great book called Brain Rules, R-U-L-E-S, and the title has a double meaning. The meaning is, what are the rules of using the brain? But the first chapter talks about the fact that you can't multitask with the kind of brain we have, and so it has that meaning too, that the brain rules what we can do and what we can't do. Now, anytime that you're doing multitasking, every time you switch from one task to another, you have what's called setup time. And just as a simple example of this, if you're sitting at your desk working and the phone rings and you pick it up and you say hello, and the person on the other end says, oh, sorry, I have the wrong number. You know, that might have taken 18 milliseconds, but you will tend to lose 10 to 15 minutes just getting back to whatever it was you were doing. Those interruptions are very costly, and so if you get 4 or 5 of those in an hour, you can actually lose an entire hour just from a few split seconds of interruption. And so one of the things that you want to do is focus on one thing at a time. Every expert on productivity that I have ever seen doing any kind of writing at all has said you have got to focus on one thing at a time, or you get nothing done very well. And one of the ways of doing this, of course, is to prioritize projects, which we'll talk about some more later. Again, you need priorities on projects, because unless you have unlimited resources, you can't do everything at the same time. In the next slide, one of the things that executives seem to think is that if they just get their people trained, that will fix all their project management problems, because the way they're defining the problem of project management is it's a lack of training on the part of the people that do the projects. And there is truth to that. There's no question that those folks have to be trained. But good project management occurs at the intersection of this Venn diagram. You need tools, you need systems, and you need people who are qualified to do the work. And the systems include things like information and planning systems. One of the things that you have to look at is the definition of project control, and that definition says that control is exercised by comparing where you are to where you're supposed to be, and then taking corrective action if you're off track. Well, that says that you need, first of all, a plan that tells you where you're supposed to be, and if you don't have a plan, then control is impossible by definition. And I think that needs to be driven home to a lot of folks, because they think firefighting is control. And again, by definition, if you have a lot of fires, you're out of control most of the time. So the objective is not to be a good firefighter, but to prevent fires. We don't want our houses being saved from burning down just because we have a good fire department. We actually want to prevent the fires. And the second component of that system is the information system. Where are we actually? And it turns out that some projects are easier to track than others. Construction projects can be a little bit easier to track because they're better defined. but even they have difficulties. And when you start talking about knowledge work projects, you go ask a person, where are you with your work? They don't really know most of the time. And so when you talk about control being exercised by comparing where you are to where you're supposed to be, and you say, well, where are you? And the person's guessing at it, and you say, where were you supposed to be? And that was a bunch of estimates too. You begin to realize that the limits of control are not very good. However, that does not excuse the fact that they're poor. It just says that you have to accept greater tolerances on control of knowledge projects than you would on well-defined construction. So you may find that you can't hit targets by much better than 25% on knowledge projects, and you can do it to about 5 to 10% on construction sometimes. Uh, we also have reward systems, and unfortunately in many organizations, reward systems reward the wrong thing. They reward behavior that we don't want instead of behavior that we do want. And the same can be said for measurement systems. How do we measure progress so that we know really something about where we are? And then information systems report that status. Again, it's hard to measure knowledge work. Tools include things like scheduling software, earned value systems for attributing cost to activities, and estimating methods. You can actually say that estimating methods are both systems and tools. But estimating methods should have some sort of historical documents associated with them, and means tables are an example of that. So those provide us with tools that tell us sort of where we are. Okay, so we've got to train our people. We've got to put systems in place that support what they do. We've got to give them tools to use, and incidentally, we also have to teach them how to use those tools properly. A lot of people get copies of Microsoft Project and receive no training on it, and I'm here to tell you that software has too many complexities to expect people to learn it on the job. So that's one of those places where once you give them the tool, you need to send them off to a class and learn how to properly use it. But I have one caution. I don't teach project management software, but if you send someone to a class on how to do this, you need to find out if the instructor has ever actually used the software to run a project or if they're just teaching you what's in the textbook, because there are some subtleties to the software that the person needs to understand, such as allocating resources on the front end of a task, the back end of a task, contour loading, et cetera, and many people do not know how to do that unless they've actually had to struggle with it. So you need an experienced project manager teaching the software itself. So pitiful project management, that's the next concern. And one of the things that I find is that people go back to work and they quickly fall back into the old routine of not really doing very much planning, and they don't know how to manage people and so on. And I can tell you that I suffered from this when I first became an engineer. I had people say, or I had people working for me on my projects who I had no clue how to deal with, and you can't take for granted that people come to the job with those skills. So that's where you do need to get your people trained to do the job. And then the one about senior managers won't accept reality. I worked with a company years ago to help them do project management, and the CEO actually came to one of the classes and introduced it, and he had my list of causes of project failure, and he came to this one and he said, no, I just can't agree with this one. He said, senior managers won't accept reality, and he laughed because he knew exactly what it meant. A lot of times, some senior manager has targets that he or she thinks must be reached, and those become the actual targets the project works to. And so I'm going to give you my own experience with this, and I'm going to tell you what I think the project manager's role is in this particular situation. I did product development for 15 years, and the last project I ran to develop a product was it was a replacement for a product that had become obsolete in the marketplace, a shipboard communications receiver. And these units sold for several $1,000s, and we were going to update that product so that it was fully synthesized in 10 hertz increments and have better performance specifications and so on. But at the same time, we wanted to reduce the cost for producing it by 30%. That is, if it had cost $1,000 to build the previous one, we wanted to produce this one for about $300 less, so about $700 to produce it. So you're making it better and making it less expensive to manufacture at the same time, and that's a really fun challenge, for at least it was for me. So I got my team together and we sat down and we did work breakdown structures and simulated schedules and so on, and we spent about a month estimating what it was going to cost to do this project. And when I told the director of engineering, and he was also the marketing VP, what it was going to cost, he almost had a heart attack. And I tell people in my classes, anytime you give a senior manager a cost for a project, you should have somebody who knows CPR standing by, because generally speaking, that's the result. They have a heart attack, and they say things like, how can it cost so much? And that's exactly what he said. How can it cost that? He said, if it's going to cost that kind of money, I'll have to get out of that market because I won't be able to get an acceptable return on investment. The company required that you get a certain level of ROI, and I don't recall what that number was specifically. And he didn't think he could sell enough product to get back the investment plus the return. And I said, I can't help you with that. We've done our homework. This is what it's going to cost. And he beat me up really badly. He kept saying he was the project manager on the previous generation product and it didn't cost that much. And I said, I know, but you were also in a different facility that had lower labor rates. And if you assume that this product is going to take about as many engineering hours as the previous one did, then my costs are automatically going to be higher just because the labor rates are higher. And he couldn't fight that one. He knew that was true, but he was still adamant that it had to be done for less. And I finally said to him, look, if you're convinced it can be done for less, I'm sorry, I'm not the project manager for you. You'll have to find someone else. Now, you may think that's being brazen or impudent or whatever. I see it as my responsibility. I see it as the responsibility of all project managers to do their homework so that they can say to an executive, this is what that project is going to take, so that they can then make an informed decision about whether to do the job or not. So when I told him that he'd have to find someone else, he said, okay, I'll go to the boss and see if I can get them to let me go for a lower return on investment. And they did. And the job came in about where we said it would. And several years later, he got out of that market because he was right in the first place. He couldn't sell enough product to make the kind of return he needed. Now, the thing is, he should have made a different decision in my opinion. He should have said, okay, let's do something else that we can make some money off of, because my numbers said you're not going to get there, and they were correct. So I see this as a responsibility, but you need to do your homework and be really sure of what you're saying, as sure as you can be when you're estimating things, in order to give that information to an executive. So we need a mutual trust situation in cases like this, rather than just pulling numbers out of the air and saying we got to meet these targets. Okay, so let's talk about cures. And I'm going to list these and I'm going to address them one by one. Prioritizing projects, addressing the systems and tools issue, supporting project managers, and using some kind of a stage gate system are the things that I think you need to do to solve the problem. So let's talk about priorities. I heard a saying a number of years ago, you can do anything but not everything at one time. And that certainly is true if we don't have unlimited resources. We have this problem at home. There are things we'd like to do and we can't afford to do all of them at the same time. We either don't have the money or the time or the help or whatnot, and so we have to prioritize. And the solution that has been demonstrated to work, and I've done this with at least one company of my own, one client company, and I know from Hewlett-Packard that they did it with some divisions. You give everybody a priority one project with a backup. And what that means is they work on the priority one project while they can, and if they have some dead time, they shift over and work on the backup project. Now, I've had a lot of people say to me, oh, that's just unrealistic. We just can't afford that. We got to get it all done. Well, you can't get it all done, so you might as well try this system and see what happens. And those priorities have to be based on the organization's mission and strategic initiatives. In the one pharmaceutical company I did this with, they let the marketing vice president and the lab vice president mutually set these priorities because some things needed to be done for technical reasons ahead of other things, and other things needed to be done for market reasons before something else. And so when they did this, they estimated that their productivity had nearly doubled over the course of the couple of years that it took to make this work. What was really interesting is you can show that there is a financial advantage to this, and if you think about it, what it amounts to is there's a cash flow advantage, because if you keep a bunch of balls in the air at one time, nobody makes a basket or a home run or anything like that. If you, on the other hand, are chipping away at your projects and releasing something today, it starts selling, revenue starts coming in, that helps you to fund the development of the next project that you're working on, and so on. So you find that there's actually a major financial advantage to prioritizing. And I don't have time to go into much more detail than that, but you get the idea, I think. Okay, addressing systems and tools. You need the following systems. You need an estimating system, and the Project Management Institute will tell you that estimates should be based on history. And what that says is you need to be collecting information as you go on how long it takes to do various facets of a project. And you need to record that time as accurately as you can within limits. And I would say work to the nearest hour in a week is probably good enough. But you need to be recording that information in such a way that you can look back later. And if you're going to do another project like that receiver replacement project I was doing, you could say, okay, it took this long on that job. This one's a little bit different, so let's add this on, or let's take this off and compensate. And of course, you need to do that at a low enough level in the project so that the numbers mean something. If you just say, well, here's what it took for this project as a whole, and this one should take about the same amount of time, that's likely to be quite incorrect. So estimating is supposed to be based on history. Now, if you don't have any history, one of the ways that people do the estimating is for several people to estimate independently of each other and then compare those numbers and reach a joint decision about what they think they should commit to. That's called consensual estimating, and that works fairly well. Then you need a tracking system. As I say, you need to know where you are. If you've ever been out on a country road, there's no signage or very little of it, it can get very frustrating wondering if you're in the right place or not. Nowadays with GPSs, we got the built-in tracking, but in the old days before GPS, that could be quite frustrating. And the same thing is true in most organizations. And then, as I said earlier, you need measurements of progress. So just how much work was accomplished here. And then the tracking system feeds that information back to the people that need it. And reward systems, I really should say we need a reward system. We need an accountability system, because if there is no accountability for results in projects, you can't expect them to come out like you need them to. So you need to be able to reward people for performance that is appropriate, and you need to be able to measure them. And then you need scheduling software of some kind. At one time, there were 150 scheduling programs around. I don't know what the number is today, but it's down to probably under a dozen. And the most popular one, of course, is Microsoft Project. The second most popular one is Primavera, which is used for very large construction projects and with 10,000 activities and things like that. So if you need something really big, that might be the kind of program that you want to look at. Mind mapping software is really useful for planning projects, and I use Mind Manager software, and you can download a trial copy of that if you need to try it out. One of the nice things about Mind Manager is that once you get a work breakdown structure created using Mind Manager, you can export the data directly into Microsoft Project so you don't have to do double entry. So it will save you a great deal of time. But it's a great tool for use in a group so that you can project the mind map up on the screen and everybody can see it, and you can drag and drop things to other places and so on. So it's very convenient. And I listed this as a tool because it's both a system and a tool, but doing lessons learned reviews and disseminating that information to everybody so that people learn from every project. The Army, of course, has what they call an after-action review, where after anything takes place, they sit down and ask themselves, what do we do well and what do we want to do better in the future? I'm very careful to say, don't ever say to people, what did we do wrong, because that makes people very defensive and they don't want to report anything. As a matter of fact, quick aside about this, when Alan Mullally took over at Ford, he used his conventional business plan review meeting to track projects at Ford, and he uses stoplight reporting for that. So you got a red, green, or yellow light, so to speak, and green says everything's wonderful, red says everything's awful, and yellow says we're making a transition. It can be going from green to yellow, or it can be going from red to yellow. And the first several weeks, everybody's progress reports were showing green. And at the end of that third week, he said, he stood up and he said, folks, I'm a little confused. He said, we're losing $16 billion this year. Are you sure we don't have any problems? And so the next week, there was one red light showed up on the reports. And of course, the reason for all this is these people were intimidated to say that they had any kind of problems, because in the past, there had been a climate of punish the person that's got problems instead of helping. So this one guy has a red report, and Alan stands up and he says, I see you have a red light on your progress report. He said, tell us what's happening. And the guy said, well, we're having a problem with the tailgate on one of our trucks. And Alan applauded and he said, thank you very much for telling us about that. What can we do to help you? And immediately before the fellow could say anything, someone in engineering spoke up and said, I think I can help you with that. I've seen that before. And another manager said, I do too. And so the problem got resolved very quickly. And the next week, there was a rainbow of stoplight reports. Alan had broken down that belief that you're going to shoot the messenger. And so we have to have a climate where we do lessons learned reviews to improve our performance, not to punish people. Okay, I said you also need to support project managers. So let me tell you about that one. When I was teaching the seminars up at University of Wisconsin, I taught the core course, which we call Project Management Tools, Principles, Practices. And I also at that time taught the team-based project management. And so we had a certificate program where you had to take 6 courses in order to get your certificate. And so a fellow came through the tools class, and several months later, he came back to the teams class, and he came up to me during break, and he said, I wanted to tell you what happened to me. He said, I left here really excited about what I learned, and so I got my team together in the conference room back at work, and my boss came looking for me, called me outside, what are you doing? And he said, I told him I was putting together a project plan. And he said, oh, you don't have time for that nonsense. Get your people out of the conference room so they can get the job done. And while I was surprised to some degree, on the other hand, I'd heard this sort of thing before. What was really puzzling to me was this program was going to cost this guy about $10,000 to go through it, and yet his boss wouldn't let him do what he was learning to do. So not only do we have to support people, we really need to make project management part of their performance appraisal if that's what they're supposed to be doing. They need to be evaluated on how well they run projects. And senior managers need to get involved in reviewing plans, because your behavior toward people signals to them what's important. And if you want good project management, you have to make sure that people understand it's important to you and to the organization. The other thing I suggest you do is give them the official title of project manager. We find that a lot of people run projects who don't have the title there. Especially it's true in biotech and engineering. And one of the kisses of death is for them to be working project managers. That is, they're expected to do a significant part of the work that's actually done in the project and manage it at the same time. And the problem with that is that when there's a push or shove between, or conflict between managing and doing, the doing always takes priority and the managing suffers. So I would urge you to make them dedicated project managers. And I'm really a fan of project management offices, which I don't like to call that. I prefer to call them project management functions. Okay, the next thing I want to suggest for you is that you have a stage gate system that allows you to track projects and either increase funding to them or cancel them if that needs to be. And first of all, select those projects that you should be doing. All projects should be aligned with the mission of the organization. If they're not aligned with the mission of the organization, you're probably doing projects that should not be done. Another guideline is that on projects that can be canceled, and there are some projects that don't have a cancellation option, on projects that can be canceled, if you cancel too many, there's something wrong with your selection process. If you don't cancel any at all, there's something wrong with your execution, because nobody's good enough to make all of them come out okay, even if they do practice good project management. So that would be the one thing I would suggest that you put in place in your organization that will pay dividends for you. Now, I want to tell you before I get into meetings about a program that we're putting into place that I think you might be interested in. When I became a project manager, well, actually, when I became an engineer, as I said earlier, I didn't know anything about managing, nor did I know anything about dealing with people. And as a guy told me in a bioscience company, he said, when I got my PhD, nobody told me I was going to have to manage anybody, and I don't know what I'm doing. And I said, welcome to the club. I didn't either. And so we're starting well, first of all, I started by reading books by Peter Drucker. At that time, that was what was available. And I found that Peter Drucker was probably one of the world's best gurus on managing organizations. And so there's a book called A Year with Peter Drucker, and I'm going to use that book as a textbook, so to speak, and work with executives over a year's period of time to help them become more effective as executives. And so, but I'm going beyond the book. The book's going to be the basic guideline, but I'm going to augment that with some videos and instruction of my own, and also review the work people are doing, because each week there will be an assignment based on some of Drucker's principles that you will apply directly to your job so that you're getting maximum benefit out of what you do. That way you should see improvements in your own performance on the job, and also learn at the same time. So I think that's the best of both worlds. So if you go to the tiny URL, and if you just write down the last letters, you can remember the first part, ZNGH9YH. That'll get you a data sheet on the program. And then if you decide that you want to register for it, tinyurl.com/J5XSRG6. And again, if you have copies of the slides, that information is in there. Now, this offer is going to be augmented, as I said, by conducting a monthly webinar for you. We're also going to help you develop metrics on how to measure performance, not only on projects, but other aspects of the organization. And if you're interested, we'll talk about how to set up a project management function. The normal cost of all that stuff would be about 12 grand, but we're including that with this program. And on top of that, in order to spice up the offering a little bit, The first 5 people to enroll in this class are going to receive 2 free seats in our online PMTPP class, the Project Management Tools, Principles, Practices class, which is a $2,990 value. And that person, the people that go through that program will get certificates from NC State University in Raleigh. Those are self-paced online programs. I use narrated PowerPoint so that it's almost the same as being in a class with me or my other instructors. The only difference is you don't see us visibly, but it's not like some of these online programs where you sit and read stuff off a screen, which I think is a total insult, and to be very candid with you. I mean, I might as well read a book as to have that kind of learning. So if you have any questions about the program, again, please feel free to email me after the broadcast is over. So that's it. I don't want to take too much of your time on this, but I did want you to know about this program. It will start in January and last through the end of December. Now, John Cleese, who was the British comedian, had a video company that made training videos, and he had one called Meetings, Bloody Meetings, and it echoes the fact that so many meetings are badly run and, in fact, cost companies huge amounts of money. And we're going to talk about that. I'm going to give you a formula for doing calculations. And I want to just check my time real quickly. We've got about 9-10 minutes, so I'm going to go through some of this stuff quickly. The slide on this page has a list of the topics I'm going to cover, so let's get into those. For example, the first one, calculate your losses. If you look at the number of people in the meeting and call that in, and you take the loaded labor rate for those people, which is the direct pay plus overhead, and in knowledge work organizations nowadays, that's typically $100 an hour, and you multiply that times the number of people, and then you think about how many meetings you have each week, that's M, and you think about the time lost in each meeting, which in many cases is 25%. Multiply all that together, and in my example, I've got 10 people at $100 an hour, 10 meetings a week, losing 25%. It's costing you $2,500 a week for losses in meetings, which is $125,000 a year based on a 52-week year. And that is essentially the salary that you might pay a whole another person, so to speak. So clearly, wasting time in meetings is something that is very costly to an organization. And I've seen statistics on this that say that nationwide we're losing something like $30 billion a year in bad meetings and not accomplishing anything. So then you have to do the meeting over and so on. And it doesn't take a great deal of discipline to improve this. So this is kind of a low-hanging fruit sort of thing if you think about it. So here are the basics. Everybody knows you ought to have an agenda for a meeting, but what a lot of people don't understand is you need a timed agenda. And so this is an example of that. You have no more than about 5 to 10 topics on your agenda. You describe what the topic is, you allocate so many minutes to it, and then you try to stick to that. And I have some guidelines here that agenda should be published 24 hours in advance of the meeting. And a lot of companies make the rule that if they don't get a timed agenda, people aren't required to go to the meeting. In fact, a lot of times they just cancel the meeting. So that's one way to do it. I also suggest that meeting duration be no longer than 2 hours. And if it's as much as 2 hours, you ought to have about a 10-minute break in between. And insist on starting on time and ending on time. I started this webcast pretty close to the dot because you're busy people and you got up early to do this, and I don't want to waste your time. And I'm not waiting for people to arrive late. So those are the kinds of rules that you need to apply. And then I'm trying to turn my own notes pages here. And then you need some roles. You need a facilitator of the meeting. That person has major responsibility for keeping it on track. You have a scribe who takes notes on discussion and decisions and things like that that are made in the meeting. And you also have a timekeeper who monitors the agenda and keeps it on track. That doesn't mean that you're rigid about this sort of thing, but it is a good way of trying to keep the meetings on track and make sure they don't run over too much. If you get right down to it, this is practicing project management on meetings, because we schedule our meetings and we try to hold to our schedules. On the next slide, there's one thing that we run into in meetings which sometimes sidetracks them, and that's emotion. When I was a young engineer, if I got upset about something, I had a boss that would say, when you come to work, leave your feelings outside. And I used to get even angrier then because I thought it was ridiculous. You can't come in with just your good emotions. And he never realized that emotion and motivation and motive are the same, have the same root. But when people do get upset about something, what it says is that means something to them. That issue means something to them. And we should treat feelings as data to be processed, not as something to be suppressed. And so the guideline is pause and give people time to think about the feelings they have and what the issue means to them, then discuss facts, and then turn to solutions. Because if you try to go to solutions when people are upset, you're just wasting your time. And I think that's pretty much it. So the next slide, I talk about a pet peeve of mine. It's becoming more and more difficult to have meetings, run classes, and so on because of people's obsession with their cell phones. And I'm also going to tell you that this is one of the biggest productivity robbers that we have right now. It turns out that studies are showing that cell phones are addictive because there is an intermittent schedule of reinforcement that takes place when you check email. 90% of the email you get is junk, and only 10% of it is of any value to you. So what happens is you check it 10 times and one time you get something useful. And that's an intermittent schedule reinforcement, and those are more powerful than regular schedules. So we get very addicted to these things. Turn off the cell phones during the meetings and no peeking at them, because in my classes I see people, they put them on vibrate or silence them or whatever, but they're still glancing at them continuously. So they're not getting much out of the class when they do that. Another principle in meetings is don't allow people to have side conversations. This is one of Alan Mullally's pet gripes about people, is they're sitting around talking while someone else is talking. So only one person talks at a time. And the last suggestion that's really important here is to ask yourself, do you really need a meeting? I see people having meetings just because it's the thing to do. And I sometimes think that they have a sense of importance when they're running meetings, but they're not accomplishing anything. And I've sat through some of those just to see for myself whether they're doing anything or not, and the answer is no. So don't have meetings if you don't need to. All right, just a quick summary so that I can go back to this. Unless you properly manage them, projects waste about 30 cents of every dollar. Prioritize them and quit multitasking is one of the ways to fix the problem. Support your project managers. Get control of your meetings by using timed agendas, having facilitators, scribes, and timekeepers, and deal with feelings, facts, and solutions. And on my last slide here, I want to thank you for attending. I know that some of you got up maybe earlier than you would prefer to be here, and I appreciate your supporting the program. For more information on our services, the website address is there. And our training programs in general are run through the Office of Professional Development at NC State University. So the phone number is there along with the web address. So thank you so much. I hope you have a good day. And I'll see you next week in the next program if you're here. Take care.